But the first component in any RPP is consultation. Consult. And that then moves towards designing a strategy which, in one form or another, is linked to national forest policy or carbon market ideas, whatever. I mean, the policy dimension is inevitably flows out of that consultative process if it's being done properly. So, hopefully, if you're optimistic, and in this design process as it was envisaged some years ago, 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years ago, the steps in which the RPP is structured will lead to an established mechanism, an MRV system, an emissions scenario, and an agreed policy. And I understand that 1 or 2 countries, Vietnam, I can't remember off the top of my head and the others, but there are a number of countries which apparently are quite well advanced in this process. They have used the money made available by the UN rating and FCPF and have actually designed their mechanism. The only problem they have is that there's no international agreement.
The issue of scaling up, maybe one of the things we should be looking at is how do we also get REDD to become a component of planning in other sectors than forest. 2 days ago there was a pavilion event, extractive industries in Central Africa, and the map was showing how in mining is space, including in protected areas. And there is still this debate, conservation versus development. And ministers in Central Africa, one is here, and it's been going around making speeches about on the need of Central Africa to move along, to take advantage of its resources to generate money that they need to invest in development. And one lesson of this is that we've remained in a kind of narrow our perspectives around protected areas, forgetting dynamics around, or very successful stories that we get comfortable in and we don't really look around. The issue of scaling up is also being capable of anticipating, seeing that forests will never remain the same. Developing countries also have ambitions of becoming influential economies. So we need to anticipate on these development dynamics and needs of the developers, and how do we make sure that each sector, if they cannot work together, can we get REDD become a kind of line of action in each of the sectoral aspects of the government, the way they function. And I'm not sure that this captures what we are looking at. It should be a way of scaling up at different levels.
Regarding your comment in FCPF in your REDD, we're currently monitoring the process in Central America, and we're quite worried on the deliverance that they are taking. It's taking them for really long while in order first to collaborate between UNEP, UNDP, FAO, and then integrate UN REDD and FCPF because they have different standards. They're having struggling on the FBIC standards and how to do it. They're struggling because it's a scaling down process. And nevertheless, also the conditions that the countries are asking in order to use that funding, I think that they should deliver in early stages. But at this key point moment, the thing is that, for example, some of them are working with the ministers of environment, and they're not even talking to the ministers of forestry. So that mingle that is going on in between who has the decision-making involved is really complex within the countries, and it's causing a lot of struggle. Secondly, when you're hearing that there's a lot of fundings, it also gets confusing. confusing because, for example, the case of Panama, they announced that FCPF and UNRED were coming, and they announced that they were going to have $8 million at once. The fundings are there, but it takes a while in order to get even to the country level, and then even discussing how it's going to be distributed becomes really an argument. So I do think that it would prevail, but if there's not an investment made by the government, there's not going to be sufficient time and money based on what UNRED and FCPF are invested. Because what we're currently seeing is that if we compare, for example, Guatemala and Panama, Guatemala has moved quicker, even though they don't have UNRED and FCPF. And Panama, when they got UNRED money, they got stuck. So sometimes even getting the fundings of those two macro systems could either facilitate the process or actually get into a bigger discussion on how that money should be used. Because there is a huge dispersion because communities thought that UNRED and FCPF money would be used to pay. So they say, you already have $8 million, why don't you start paying REDD? So there's a lot of tangling, and the institutions, what they did is that ministers of environment are really weakened in the undeveloped countries, so they're grabbing that money and paying for all the staff and trying to survive with that money. So sometimes it could be tricky, the system, how UNRED and FCPF will actually engage in a country level. Then how it's going to be that use of that fundings, because even though I have seen countries that they are discussing of benefit sharing of the UNRED fund, so you're like, no guys, that's another chapter of the dilemma. No, because we want a free prior and consent and a benefit sharing discussion on the UNRED funding. Yes and no, so it's a lot of confusion. And when you're hearing that amounts of money are coming, and if you see Panama, Guyana, Brazil, Indonesia, the ones that are already having the fund, they're moving even slower. And Honduras, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, there are countries that don't have that funding, that they're in the pipeline, but they're even moving quicker. And finally, we're seeing that countries are being stuck after delivering and being approved by the RPP. Now, on the face of REDD Readiness, actually implemented the strategy, they're like, okay, I did my PIN, I did my RPP, everything is clear, now I can go out and deliver the markets, and they're like, yeah, now you have to implement your national strategy. And they're like, I don't know how to do that. $8 billion is not enough. And now, how can I take more money? So there's a lot of serious issues, and countries are overloading REDD as well, because they want REDD to fix land tenure, poverty, food security, vulnerability, adaptation, mitigation, benefit sharing, rights and conditions of people. So the list is going on, and you're like, no guys, REDD is just one issue. And now they'll say, now you should bring FIP, Forest Investment Program, and also put flight on the top, so you can make a bundle, and then you can fix everything in your country. So, and the people are getting so frustrated, even within government, because they're overloaded with so much discussions. They have to be the focal point for the international. They have to ask for UNRED and FCPF money. They have to deliver. They have to do benefit sharing and the free prior consent. So it's getting really complicated, even for government to do so. I do think that in a certain way, UNRED and FCPF should deliver, but they have to have a more clear comprehension of the national context, how they have to play with the multi-stakeholder dialogue.
Just a very quick response to that. I mean, without going into a discussion about the sort of what has happened with UNRED and FCPF, I think possibly the interesting thing then to do is look and see what has been done in places where the UNRED and FCPF were not present. In other words, look at the Brazilian experience. Study the Brazilian experience, see how they've gone about reducing rates of deforestation and degradation. They did not receive a single centavo from UNRED and FCPF.
Yeah, I think in respect to scaling up, I pick up from where Mike ended the other time, and that's the aspect of policy. looking at what is taking place, especially now that several countries are developing their climate change policies, which includes REDD. For example, in the case of Uganda, the most interesting and the stakeholder to look at is strengthening the role and involvement of policymakers, especially Parliament. The opportunity is that they are now already organizing in parliamentary forums on climate change. And if we educate them, build their capacity, these are the people who inform, who make decisions on developing bills and implementation frameworks for these strategies. They also hold the ministries responsible, accountable for all actions related to whatever is happening in REDD and other issues. So the involvement and the strengthening of parliamentary forums that are related to climate change will give us a good headway on the issues of scaling up benefit sharing mechanism and realization of the objectives. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd have two comments and I'll make them quick. The first is that I think when we start talking about scaling up and items like that, I think we need to be very careful with the comparisons we make. Countries that are far along in the process may have started off with a very good forest inventory and very clear tenure mapping, and had already had their own remote sensing service like Brazil, where they use satellites to measure change. And so I think that's one thing we need to be careful about when we're drawing comparisons, is if the country doesn't have a fund. I always take the example of the Philippines because I have a fair amount of work experience there through projects. And when your last inventory was in 1956, that's a pretty hard thing to start from, as how much change has happened as a result of an action. And so that might be a reason why the Philippines is moving more slowly through these processes. But on a separate issue, I mean, we can get bogged down, I think, a lot in REDD Plus discussions. And I think at the end of the day, I would encourage it, echo Mike's comment. I think one of the most useful things when we think about how as a conservation community we can become involved in forest and climate issues, how we can become involved nationally and affect process, affect change. If you go to Forest Carbon Partnership Facility or the UN REDD website and look for a readiness preparation proposal, what you'll find for most countries is four chapters in a document. The first is identification of the stakeholder mapping, about who's there, how the government is proposing going about consultation. And that includes what organizations they're planning and structures they're planning and setting up. That include agriculture, forestry, environment, and usually mining is usually one of the things that people are forced to discuss. Those might not yet be created, but these are the things. It's essentially a needs assessment that says this is what we are proposing to deal with forest and climate issues in our country. Then goes and does another module that talks about gap analysis, about legislation and regulatory reform that will be required, and talks about how do you measure all the change, how do you measure what's there, and then you talk about co-benefits. And those four pieces plus a couple chapters to make donors happy on monitoring and on budgets, those essentially identify how much it costs to do all those sorts of changes, and so it becomes a donor map. But in all that, the one thing that's not really clarified anywhere, and I've reviewed 13 of them in my previous work, is there's nothing about benefit sharing systems. And that, to me, the question for me, or the question for the group really going forward in my mind is, where does that fit in all the structures? You obviously you consult with the stakeholders through the processes about the benefits that are distributed from the change, but how do you go about doing all that portion? How do you go about designing the system and those sorts of things? Those are the really challenging questions, and so I would encourage people to read these documents.
Well, maybe following up to what Patrick is saying, one thing we should look at is to see if countries who are considered advanced in this started with the phased approach or they just say, let's go down and do REDD, and we will learn from our experiences. And I'm not so sure how long this rational state phase approach will last, how ready countries will be before they start really doing REDD and learning from their experiences to move forward. So I think one of the things that we should really look at is how do we really get into doing undertaking activities, and maybe it could be a solution to the scaling of activities, because countries are saying we want to do REDD. They are following the phased approach because this is a condition for accessing funding, not necessarily because they think that that is what they should do to really get ready. And as was pointed out at the beginning of this, at the introductory presentation, we need to rethink whether we should remain locked into the phased approach that has been adopted and put as a condition for getting funding to move forward.
There's a struggle that we're currently having in the region, is that there's Mexico, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, they have forest government incentives. And together they're investing $600 million a year in incentives. So what we're struggling is that should we work in order to push REDD forward and get UN REDD and FCTF, that is $8 million for the whole package? Or should the communities start making a lot of advocacy and work towards getting that funding and being in a more efficient way, because the governments are really investing in forests. The thing is that it's not quite efficient enough and effective. So it's spread all over, and it needs a more coherent way of implementation. But there's not any amount of money on REDD that can actually compete with that funding that the government is giving. Mexico, in ProArbol, PES, Pago por Servicio Ambiental, and Zagarpa, they are investing $500 million a year. Guatemala, with 2 programs, they are investing $80 million a year. And Costa Rica, with CONAPIPO, they are investing $19 million a year. That's a fund even bigger than UNRED. So the key question is that should we target it that could be a REDD? It's already a REDD existing process that needs some tooling, but it can deliver. That's the thing that we should start contributing and focus. Secondly, I think that a lot of discussions are being made on the multi-stakeholder platform discussions and the community. But have we asked the government what they really want? For example, I have seen that in Mexico and Guatemala, they have a clear statement of what the national REDD strategy will be. Is reducing of deforestation, reduction of illegal logging, and reduction of poverty. Those are the 3 targets that they want to prevail. If you go to Panama, they are not clear on what they want. But they already have their RPP and the UN REDD and the FCTF approved. But when you really ask them is that what is REDD going to be this national strategy and what are your 3 targets? They maybe biodiversity or maybe watershed, and they start struggling. So one is there are already existing fundings enough to cover situations that can prevail, REDD systems that have been proven for 10, 20 years. And they are already there. So we need to tag along and learn about them. Secondly, we need to interact more with government in order to see what their national targets are, and if they are clear, and if they have been consulted. Because at the end, what we need is national strategies that are framed into legal framework of analysis. So that should be a more coherent process for us to deliver in working together with the government. And thirdly, I think that in most of the cases that we tackle REDD projects, like Philippines and Guyana, and even REDD in Panama, they were not forest countries. So they're really struggling on how to deliver, because if you go to Panama, Panama has never been a forest country. Never. They don't do forest management. If you go to the communities, the indigenous communities, they are starting to be forest management. And their forest system is to get to the private sector. But the key system is if you go to Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, they are forest countries. So they have a more coherent political forest platform than the other ones. So those are three essence that we should need to have, because at the end of the line, REDD is directly targeted on forest.
Okay, recognizing that we're kind of winding down on time and of the energy levels, we have Chris and Gary to wrap things up. And one thing I'll maybe do is throw just an extra wrinkle of challenge as we do the wrap up. It seemed to me there's so much complexity involved, and so I might ask, pose both to you, what's one thing that you'll take out of these discussions that we've had over the last couple of hours?
Well, I mean, we all knew this coming in, and it just reinforced it. For me, it's obviously the complexity of the challenging complexity of trying to understand, how to develop a benefit sharing mechanism that works properly. You know, given the local context, the national challenges, and legal frameworks and all that, but also the need for standardization and